Life presents everyone with moments when they must make difficult choices, especially in youth when life experience is lacking. This is the very dilemma the main character of this story found herself in. Being very young, she ended up at the center of a love triangle, not realizing how dangerous it could be. Unfortunately, the girl didn't have time to grasp the full gravity of her situation. 19-year-old Cayley Mandadi was a sophomore at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. She was in a relationship with 22-year-old Mark Howerton, but at the same time continued to maintain a connection with her ex-boyfriend Jett Birchum. Cayley met Mark while still dating Jett, and for a long time hesitated about which of them to choose. On October 29, 2017, Cayley and Mark attended an annual music festival in San Antonio. There, the young couple drank alcohol and smoked marijuana, then engaged in consensual sexual intercourse. After this, the girls suddenly lost consciousness. Mark noticed that she stopped breathing, so without wasting a second, he put her in the car and raced to the nearest hospital. The medics made every effort to save Cayley's life, using various methods and equipment, but unfortunately to no avail. Later, the doctors officially declared the death of the young cheerleader as a result of her injuries. And there were many of them, which shocked the girl's mother when she first saw her daughter in the hospital. The woman got the impression that Cayley had either been thrown off a bridge or jumped out of a plane herself, so mutilated was her body. Cayley was brought to the hospital in an extremely critical condition. At least 7 times, the medics performed artificial respiration on the girl and were able to get her heart started, but each time it stopped again. Cayley fell into a coma, so to sustain her life, she was connected to special equipment. The doctors fought for the girl's life for 2 days, but eventually it became clear that Cayley's brain was no longer functioning. The medics had to inform the patient's parents that there was no hope of recovery. So the decision was made to disconnect Cayley from the ventilator. The family insisted on fulfilling the girl's last wish. She had always wanted that in the event of a tragedy, her organs be donated to save other people's lives. The parents stayed by their daughter's side until the very end and could not believe the reality of what was happening. But unfortunately, it was true, the young student passed away without ever regaining consciousness. The cause of Cayley's death, according to the forensic experts, was a traumatic brain injury. Fractures of the skull and collarbone were found, inflicted by a blunt object. Moreover, the girl's face was so disfigured that it seemed as if some monster, not a human, had mutilated her. The family simply could not believe it. At the time of the tragedy, Cayley Mandadi had just turned 19. She was a sophomore in the public relations department at Trinity University. Cayley was a bright and popular girl who was respected in the university's female community. She was part of the cheerleading squad. Cayley had charm and charisma, so she easily made friends, was sociable, and quickly found common ground with any company, arousing general admiration. Cayley's best friend said that the girl was interested not only in studying, she strived to build a personal life and loved to have fun. Immediately after entering university, Cayley fell in love with her first boyfriend, Jett Birchum. This feeling became her first deep love, which she then could not forget in any way. Cayley and Jett met in their freshman year. The young man was a talented athlete, and a spark immediately flared up between them. Cayley considered Jett her dream and was very proud of their relationship. However, as the deceased girl's mother noted, it was more of a typical infatuation between 2 teenagers. The couple had occasional disagreements, with feelings fading and then flaring up again. Cayley's plans included starting her own family and having children. Already in her sophomore year, she was sure that Jett shared her aspirations. But later, The girl began to feel that her chosen one was too frivolous about life and did not think about the future. Realizing this, Cayley decided to move on. It was during this period that she met Mark Howerton. Although he was not a student at Trinity University, he had friends there. There was an immediate mutual attraction between Cayley and Mark. They quickly found common ground and began dating. However, the girl never completely broke off her relationship with Jett, so she actually started a romance with two guys at once. Moreover, both Mark and Jett knew about each other's existence, and it seemed as if Cayley had set up some kind of competition, intending to choose the best of them. Both young men disapproved of the girl's experiments and insisted that she finally make up her mind. However, Cayley did not have time to resolve this love triangle. Literally a month after Mark appeared in her life, the girl was hospitalized with life-threatening injuries. This happened on October 29, 2017, at about 10:30 p.m. That's when Mark Howerton brought Cayley to the medical facility in his car. While the doctors were making every effort to save the victim's life, law enforcement officers had already arrived at the scene and began talking to 22-year-old Mark. To have a conversation in a calmer setting, they took the young man to the quietest place they could find within the walls of the medical facility, the hospital chapel. According to Mark, he and the girl spent the weekend at a music festival in San Antonio. There, the young people drank alcohol and smoked marijuana. As the cops found out, this leisure scenario was a common thing for the couple. Mark reported that between 5 and 6 p.m., they left the festival and drove off in his Mercedes. During this car ride, an argument broke out between the lovers, triggered by Cayley's confession that she still had feelings for her ex-boyfriend Jett. Mark tried to convince the girl to break off her relationship with her former lover and stop all communication with his circle. Eventually, he managed to calm Cayley down, and she promised to think about it. Later, the couple stopped near the nearest gas station and engaged in intimate relations. According to Mark, the sex between them was quite rough. He squeezed the girl's neck with his hands and slapped her face, but as the young man claimed, Cayley enjoyed such intense sensations. Despite the police officers' attempts to latch onto these details, Mark insisted that everything happened by mutual consent. But on that fateful evening, something went wrong. According to the young man, after intercourse, they talked for about 5 more minutes, and then Cayley began complaining of a headache. Mark didn't think much of it, assuming that the girl had simply overdone it with the alcohol and weed. But just a few seconds later, she suddenly passed out and started snoring, yet even at that moment Mark didn't become alarmed. Instead, he decided to take Cayley to his apartment in Houston, thinking that she had simply fallen asleep due to fatigue and the influence of psychoactive substances. At some point, the girl stopped snoring and showing any signs of life at all, which made Mark wary. Only then did he feel uneasy. The young man felt for a pulse on Cayley's neck, but, as it seemed to him, the girl's heart was no longer beating and she wasn't breathing. After that, Mark rushed to the hospital as quickly as possible, worried about his girlfriend's condition. The detectives who undertook to investigate this case were convinced that the horrific injuries on the deceased's body indicated a brutal beating. They repeatedly interrogated Mark but had nothing to go on. The only discrepancy in his testimony concerned where exactly the couple was immediately before the tragedy. At first, Mark claimed that they were spending time at the gas station, and then admitted that they had driven to a deserted parking lot behind the gas station, but overall this detail did not compromise the young man in any way. Mark did not confess to murder, and there was a lack of concrete evidence against him, so the young man was released without charges being filed. However, he still remained the prime suspect, as no one believed his story. It was obvious that the girl had been mercilessly beaten before her death. The situation changed dramatically only 3 months later, when a full report came in from the expert who conducted the autopsy. In his opinion, the cause of Cayley's death was blunt force trauma to the face and head, so the incident was reclassified as intentional homicide. On this basis, Mark was arrested on February 28, 2018, and charged with kidnapping, murder, and rape. However, the suspect denied his guilt, and some time later he was released on bail pending trial. It might have seemed that this would be a fairly simple case, as there was no doubt about who the deceased girl was spending time with. But the deeper the police delved into the intricacies of this story, analyzing the suspect's personality, as well as details from the victim's life, the more they unraveled a whole tangle of fatal mistakes that ultimately led Cayley to the autopsy table. Mark's relatives immediately hired a lawyer to defend, as they believed, the young man's innocence. The defender was convinced that his client had been subjected to repression undeservedly. In his opinion, the charges brought were the result of negligence and carelessness on the part of the investigators. The lawyer argued that Mark was not involved in the girl's murder, and her injuries could have been the result of a fall at the music festival or sustained as a result of the resuscitation measures taken by the medics to save the victim's life. The work of law enforcement was significantly complicated by the fact that, despite the large crowd at the concert where the tragedy occurred, they were unable to find even a single witness to the event. The defender of the main suspect insisted that his client could not have committed murder, as his overall behavior did not correspond to the typical model of a criminal's actions. After all, instead of trying to hide traces of the crime and get rid of the body, Mark immediately took the victim to the hospital, seeking to get her help. Of course, the goal of the defense was to create the most positive image of the defendant. And to the prosecution's misfortune, the suspect's lawyer turned out to be an outstanding professional with extensive experience in such cases. 2 years had passed since the tragic death of Cayley Mandadi, and only in December 2019 did Mark Howerton face trial on charges of her murder. The prosecution assumed that on October 29, 2017, the defendant forcibly dragged the student into his car, thus abducting her from the music festival. Then, according to the prosecution, the young man took the girl to a deserted parking lot behind the gas station. It was there that an argument broke out between them, the reason for which was Mark's jealousy of another guy. In a fit of rage, Howerton raped Cayley and brutally beat her, causing a cerebral hemorrhage and, as a result, irreversible processes in her body. And when the victim stopped showing any signs of life, the young man, frightened, tried to save the situation and raced to the hospital. Mark cherished the hope that the medics would be able to resuscitate the girl, which is why he went to the medical facility. However, in the opinion of the suspect's lawyer, the prosecution's version was wrong from beginning to end, starting with the allegation of kidnapping and ending with the accusations of beating. The prosecution indeed did not have a single witness who could confirm the assumption that the girl was forcibly put into the car and taken from the festival. The defender insisted that the bruises and other injuries on Cayley's body could have appeared as a result of the active resuscitation measures taken by the medics in an attempt to save her life. After all, it is known that the doctors tried to bring the girl back to consciousness at least 7 times before realizing the futility of these efforts. Unfortunately, the only person who could confirm or refute the defendant's words was already dead. And although the version about Cayley being injured by medical personnel seemed rather absurd, the prosecutor was forced to refute all, even the least likely options for how the girl received bodily injuries, which Howerton's lawyer so insisted on. But this required witnesses who could at least partially reconstruct the events of that fatal evening. So, the investigators first of all questioned the ambulance workers who came to the call to save the student. Their ambulance was parked nearby in the medical facility's parking lot, waiting for the next call. Suddenly, behind them, some car stopped with a sharp brake, which immediately attracted the attention of the medics. They saw a young man who was desperately waving his hand and begging them to come over. It was none other than Mark Howerton. When the paramedics ran up, the guy showed them an unconscious girl in the passenger seat of his car who was no longer breathing, and desperately begged for help. Looking into Mark's car, the medics became even more wary. Cayley was lying completely naked on the passenger seat, her clothes were scattered in disarray on the floor at her feet. The girl was unconscious. But what struck the doctors the most was something else. The victim's entire body was covered in bruises, with clear traces of hematomas visible even on the inner surface of her thighs. The medics immediately set about performing artificial respiration and indirect cardiac massage on Cayley. The testimony of the paramedics made it possible to expose the falsity of the suspect's claims that he did not beat his girlfriend. After all, when Mark had just brought Cayley to the hospital, the bruises all over her body were already present. Thus, the improbable version put forward by the defense turned out to be, as initially assumed, a complete slander. It also became clear at the medical facility that Howerton had informed the doctors that Cayley had overdosed. The young man admitted that over the weekend, they had been actively using drugs and alcohol together. But during the examination of the deceased's body, no symptoms characteristic of overdose or poisoning were found. While providing first aid to the girl, someone from the medical staff took several photos of Mark, the same young man who had brought Cayley to the hospital. Several people immediately noticed his excessively red fists. It seemed as if the guy had been fighting with someone for a long time just before that. Howerton was quite muscular in general. Many of his acquaintances and relatives confirmed that Mark was an avid gym-goer and constantly used steroids. However, during the 2 years that he spent under supervision while awaiting trial, the guy had lost so much weight that he became completely unlike his former self. This only confirmed the suspicions about the use of anabolic steroids to gain muscle mass. But it is well known that such drugs often cause sharp mood swings, uncontrolled outbursts of aggression, and loss of self-control. That is why they often lead to assaults or provoke confrontational behavior. Therefore, Cayley could indeed have inadvertently provoked her lover's furious anger with just one word. At first, Mark showed his full willingness to cooperate with the investigation and even allowed a search of his car without a warrant. In it, the detectives found a gun and narcotics. Howerton's defender immediately latched onto this fact as an argument in favor of his client's innocence. He claimed that no real criminal would ever go for such active contact with law enforcement. However, the prosecution continued to stand its ground. The prosecutor was convinced that Mark had beaten Cayley to death, that's why numerous bruises remained on the girl's body. To support this version, the prosecution provided photographs from the hospital that recorded many bruises already at the stage of hospitalization, before any medical manipulations were carried out. The clinic staff confirmed that all these injuries were already present immediately after the victim was brought to the medical facility. So in light of all this, Mark's confession about rough sex seemed unconvincing at the very least. But at the same time, it suggested the possibility of rape. The prosecutors quickly saw through the suspect's tactics. In their opinion, the demonstrative readiness to cooperate with the investigation was only a way to divert suspicion from his own person. The defense, in turn, insisted that similar injuries could have appeared on the girl as a result of the resuscitation measures taken by the doctors. And although the medics did not deny such a possibility regarding minor hematomas, they continued to maintain that by the time Cayley arrived at the clinic, there were already many serious injuries on her body. Moreover, it is unlikely that minor bruises would lead to a lethal outcome, because the girl's death occurred as a result of a severe traumatic brain injury, which the medical staff could not have inflicted in any way. Cayley Mandadi died at the hands of her lover, and to prove this, the prosecutors decided to dwell in more detail on the difficult relationship between Mark Howerton and the deceased. One of Cayley's closest friends admitted, shortly before the tragic denouement, she herself witnessed a horrifying incident. Jealous Mark was against his girlfriend going to a party, but Cayley ignored it and still went to hang out. When she returned home with her friend, an enraged Howerton was waiting for her. In a fit of rage, he grabbed the girl and with all his strength threw her against the wall. At the same time, Mark threatened that the next time he would definitely smash Cayley's face if she did it again. He also promised to cause serious harm to his beloved if she even talked to another guy. Despite the cruelty of this incident, Cayley did not suffer any visible injuries then and did not go to the police. However, her best friend considered Howerton's behavior abnormal and tried in every possible way to convince Mandadi herself of this. However, she surprisingly calmly reacted to her boyfriend's outburst. So the friend concluded that for Mark, such outbursts of aggression were more of a pattern than an exception. Several people testified about the young man's violent temper. But the defendant's lawyer skillfully used the opposite reviews as well. Howerton's ex-girlfriend said that he never allowed himself to be aggressive towards them. But there was one nuance here: Mark dated these girls before he started using steroids. On the other hand, the guy's friends and acquaintances claimed that it was precisely after starting the anabolic course that he became hot-tempered and irritable. Mark would get into some kind of conflict over and over again, and often provoked them himself, which was not noticed behind him before. However, all these metamorphoses did not have any particular consequences until the tragic trip to the music festival. But even before that, during one of Mark's quarrels with Cayley, the neighbors even called the police. When law enforcement officers arrived on the call, Howerton for some reason categorically forbade them to inspect Mandadi's room, where he was at that time. Although in fact, the girl herself rented this dwelling, and she was not there at that moment. The investigators suspected that Cayley had run away from home for a reason. Later, she did return, and the conflict seemed to be quickly settled. However, the police were alarmed by the deplorable state of the room in the dormitory where the student lived. The balcony door was shattered, furniture overturned and broken, a laptop smashed, and clothes hanging haphazardly on the trees near the building. Howerton, in a fit of rage, had trashed everything there, for which he was even banned from appearing on the campus grounds for a while. Cayley's friend was convinced that this conflict marked the final breakup of the relationship between the lovers. The girl no longer wanted to see or talk to Mark, and even ignored his calls. But later, the couple made up again. The prosecutors presented the couple's correspondence from messengers in court. The text of the messages clearly indicated how painfully the boyfriend reacted to the very thought of breaking up. In one of them, Mark sent a creepy selfie, putting a gun to his temple. He threatened to end his life if Cayley did not call. With such manipulations, he sought to pressure the girl. As a result of all this, Mandadi found herself drawn into a dangerous relationship triangle. Even before the described events, she had told her ex-boyfriend Jett that she finally realized her mistake and would like to return to him. But after seeing that alarming photo later, Cayley sincerely feared that Howerton might really do something to himself. And this allowed the guy to manipulate his passion. Mandadi herself repeatedly confessed that she was in love with both young men and simply could not make a choice. Only Mark's aggressive antics made her think about ending the relationship with him. However, he put all kinds of pressure on Cayley and did everything to keep her with him. And for a while, these manipulations worked. In October 2017, at a music festival, Mandadi told Jett that she was breaking off her romantic relationship with Mark. As a farewell, she even agreed to go to the concert with Howerton, because she feared that left alone with her, the unbalanced guy would again lose control of himself. However, in the presence of a large crowd, the girl felt quite safe. Heading to the festival, Mark stopped along the way to pick up another friend, so the three of them set off together. But not long before reaching their destination, the company stopped for a while on the sidelines. There, the young men, away from prying eyes, smoked marijuana. And even after arriving at the venue, they continued to use weed along with alcohol. One of the witnesses, who was also hanging out with Mark and Cayley at the time, said that at some point another conflict erupted between the couple. In the end, Mandadi couldn't stand it and stated that she was dumping her boyfriend. After this incident, an irritated Mark dragged the girl towards his car, and, as their mutual friend noticed, he did it against her will. From that ill-fated evening, Cayley never returned to her dorm room. Her best friend immediately suspected that the girl was in trouble, and that Howerton was involved in this. As it later turned out, these fears were justified. However, at that moment, no one yet knew that Mandadi was in the hospital, where medics were desperately trying to save her life. And when the frightened girlfriends contacted Mark, he lied to them, claiming that Cayley had simply fallen asleep and could not talk at the moment. However, the guy did not say a word that at this very moment his beloved's life was hanging by a thread. During the court hearing, Jett, Cayley's first boyfriend, also testified in the case. He said that he was also at that festival and saw the conflict with Mark with his own eyes. Jett decided not to intervene in the quarrel, because the girl herself asked him not to do it. She was determined to finally sever all ties with Mark and did not want to escalate the situation once again. Cayley believed that she would be able to persuade her manipulative boyfriend to leave her alone once and for all, and then everything would be fine. When Jett, like the rest of Cayley's friends, failed to find the missing girl, he began actively searching the student dormitory where she lived during her studies. But no trace of Mandadi was found there either. Only later did university friends learn the terrible truth: the student had died in the hospital, never recovering from the consequences of severe head injuries. At the trial, it was Jett Birchum who turned out to be a key witness for the prosecution. It was only thanks to his testimony that the prosecutors had good reason to charge Mark Howerton with rape, kidnapping, and murder all at once. However, the defendant's lawyer acted remarkably professionally. He tried with all his might to whitewash his client, and time after time exposed Jett for false statements. In particular, it soon became apparent that this main witness did not actually see with his own eyes how the accused forcibly put Cayley into his car. Although at first, Birchum claimed that he personally observed Howerton dragging the girl to the car despite her resistance. This discrepancy surfaced after several clarifying questions. Why, then, did Jett not intervene and prevent the abduction if he really witnessed it? It turns out that at that moment Mandadi and Mark had already disappeared from Birchum's field of vision. So in fact, the guy did not catch the moment of Cayley getting into the car, but only heard about it from acquaintances, but could not name specific names. All these facts gave good reason to suspect the young man of false testimony and dealt a devastating blow to the prosecution's case. Now, in the eyes of the jury, Jett no longer looked like a reliable witness, which greatly undermined confidence in his testimony in general. Moreover, during the investigation, photographs of drugs, suspicious contacts, and correspondence were found on Birchum's mobile phone. All this suggested his unhealthy passion for illegal substances. As it turned out, at the time of Cayley's death, he was just on probation, as he had been detained as a well-known marijuana supplier in San Antonio. Jett was subjected to a merciless cross-examination, during which the guy refused to answer the questions of Howerton's lawyer at all, which, however, was his legal right. However, the virtuoso tactics of the defense actually drove the witness into a corner, forcing him to resort to self-justification. And this despite the fact that the prosecution guaranteed Birchum full immunity from criminal prosecution in exchange for honest testimony. Therefore, his behavior looked extremely suspicious, as if he was really involved in some shady business, but in every possible way avoided drawing the attention of the prosecution to them. The atmosphere in the courtroom was getting increasingly heated. Mark's defender even managed to dig up that Jett had problems with the law before. Not long before the incident with Cayley, he was expelled from the university due to accusations of harassment against one of the students, who wrote a statement against him to the police. Although the conflict was eventually settled, and the case did not reach serious consequences, voluntary expulsion from the university was still necessary. An independent forensic expert and several other specialists suggested that the head injury that led to the hemorrhage and ultimately proved fatal was actually absent at the time the girl arrived at the medical facility. They believed that Cayley could have received it later, already during an accidental fall in the hospital. However, such a version in no way explained why Mandadi lost consciousness at all and ended up in the hospital. After all, the reason for seeking help was the craniocerebral injury itself. Another final argument of the lawyer was the fact that bruises all over the body could have appeared as a result of preparing the deceased for posthumous organ donation, which she personally insisted on during her lifetime. But all these assumptions sounded strange at the very least, especially given the suspect's reddened fists, which indicated a recent fight. Based on the information about the nature of the injuries Cayley received, a 3D model was created, and then, with the involvement of actors of similar build in the same car, the course of events was recreated. In this way, the prosecution tried to prove to the jury the violent nature of the victim's death. In addition, a toxicological examination revealed a high content of substances capable of increasing blood pressure in the blood of the deceased. And this, in turn, significantly increased the risk of internal hemorrhages and ruptures of blood vessels. Medics involved by the defense confirmed, against the background of all the circumstances that emerged during the investigation, even a relatively mild head injury could well provoke serious bleeding. But the prosecutors were adamant, in their opinion, Cayley's death occurred as a result of premeditated murder. Such a version was primarily evidenced by the specific biography of the accused, as well as the girl's skull fracture, which could not have been caused by the action of psychoactive substances in any way. The first hearing in the case was surprisingly nervous, after which the jury went to deliberate in order to determine the verdict. And just a few hours later, the defense received a shocking phone call. A new unexpected witness contacted the lawyer. This man confessed that he saw the actual condition the deceased was in when she was first brought to the medical center. After all, on that fatal night, he was just on duty at the hospital reception. And according to this witness, when Cayley was just brought to the hospital, there were no bruises on her body at all. He suggested that the hematomas could have appeared later as a result of internal bleeding that developed due to prolonged interruptions in the work of the heart and preparation of the body for organ removal for transplantation. Everyone expected that confirmation of these words could completely remove all charges from Mark Howerton. But, as the judge explained, at this stage of the process, the law no longer allowed the testimony of new witnesses to be included in the case. The deliberation of the verdict dragged on for a whole 10 hours and lasted 2 days. The jurors could not come to a common opinion and make a final decision in any way. Obviously, the available information was not enough to fully satisfy the thirst for justice on the part of the deceased's relatives. So in the end, the servants of Themis recognized that the first trial was conducted with procedural violations, and scheduled a retrial in the case. Despite such a twist, both sides declared their readiness to continue to defend their position until justice was achieved. The defense planned to seek a review of the case, emphasizing the newly discovered insincerity of Jett Birchum's testimony and the unexpected appearance of a new witness. Meanwhile, the parents of the deceased continued to insist that they did not doubt Howerton's guilt for a moment. In the end, the prosecution did indeed re-indict Mark Howerton. In June 2023, a new trial began, this time behind closed doors for the media, so many details remained behind the scenes. Back in 2018, the young man faced life imprisonment if his guilt in committing premeditated murder could be proven. During the second trial, the qualification of the crime was changed to assault under aggravating circumstances. The prosecutors brought in a new expert, a domestic violence specialist who told the jury about the typical signs of an abuser. In his opinion, Mark fit this profile. He sought to isolate Cayley from her entourage, was morbidly jealous, and constantly resorted to manipulation. And in the end, he completely lost self-control in a fit of blind rage. The specialist emphasized, the 19-year-old girl, due to her young age, had no idea what a dangerous person she was involved with and what trouble she had gotten into. And again, fierce debates broke out in the courtroom about how exactly Cayley got her injuries. Howerton's defense failed to involve a new key witness, while the prosecutor's arguments were more convincing. Despite the fact that the young man denied his involvement to the last, the jury found him guilty of the murder of Cayley Mandadi. The sentence was the maximum severity. Mark was sentenced to 20 years in prison. That's all for now. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Give this video a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any future content. Take care and goodbye.